Have you ever felt like life is slipping through your fingers, like no matter how much you plan, prepare, or hold on, everything eventually changes? One day, you feel secure in a relationship, and the next, it's gone. You work hard to build a career, only to realize that success is fleeting. You try to define yourself, who you are, what you believe, what you stand for, but over time, even your own identity seems to shift like sand in the wind. If everything is constantly changing, what can we truly rely on? What is real? Buddhism offers an answer not through blind faith, but through direct insight. The concept of Shunyata, or emptiness, is one of the most profound and liberating teachings in Buddhist philosophy. But what does emptiness really mean? To many, the word itself sounds unsettling, even nihilistic, as if it suggests that nothing matters or that life is devoid of meaning. But the Buddha did not teach emptiness as a form of despair. In fact, he presented it as the gateway to freedom, a way to see life without distortion, without clinging, without unnecessary suffering. At the core of this teaching is a simple yet radical truth: nothing exists independently. Everything we see, touch, and experience arises because of causes and conditions. Nothing has an inherent, fixed nature, not objects, not thoughts, not even our sense of self. This might seem unsettling at first, but in reality, it is profoundly liberating. If nothing is fixed, then nothing can truly limit us. If nothing exists independently, then we are deeply interconnected with all things. This insight changes everything. It shifts how we see our relationships, our desires, our struggles, and even our own identity. Imagine living with full engagement, yet without fear. Imagine experiencing love, joy, and even sorrow, without being weighed down by attachment. This is what emptiness reveals: not the absence of life, but a deeper, more vivid presence within it. The Buddha once said, "In what is seen, there is only the seen. In what is heard, there is only the heard. In what is sensed, there is only the sensed. In what is cognized, there is only the cognized." At first glance, this statement seems almost too simple. But it carries an astonishing depth. Normally, when we experience something, we don't just see, hear, or feel. We add layers of meaning, judgment, and attachment. We see a beautiful sunset and think, "I wish this moment could last forever." We hear criticism and immediately feel, "I am being attacked." We feel sadness and believe, "This pain defines me." But what if we could experience life without adding these extra layers? This is the power of emptiness. It allows us to meet life as it is, not as our mind projects it to be. Instead of being trapped by illusions, chasing after what we crave, resisting what we fear, we can move freely. We can appreciate beauty without clinging to it, face pain without being destroyed by it, and engage with life without being weighed down by the need to control it. To understand emptiness is to understand freedom. And that journey begins not with blind belief, but with direct experience. Chapter 1: The Essence of Emptiness, Shunyata. When people first hear the word emptiness, they often react with unease. The term conjures images of an infinite void, a vast nothingness, or even an existential abyss where life loses meaning. To many, the idea of emptiness seems like a denial of existence, a rejection of everything that makes life tangible. But this misunderstanding stems from a deep-seated habit, our tendency to view the world through a lens of permanence and inherent identity. Buddhism does not teach emptiness as non-existence. Instead, it points to something far more profound: the absence of inherent existence. This distinction is crucial. Emptiness does not mean that things do not exist. It means that they do not exist independently, without reliance on causes and conditions. It is an insight that transforms the way we see the world, not by negating it, but by allowing us to experience it as it truly is. Imagine picking up a handful of sand. At first glance, it seems like a solid mass, something that can be grasped and held. But as you look closer, you realize that it is nothing more than countless tiny grains, loosely gathered in your palm. There is no singular sand, only individual grains, momentarily held together by external conditions. This is how all things exist, including our own sense of self. Everything we experience, our thoughts, our identities, even the objects around us, exists only due to a web of interdependent conditions. Strip away those conditions, and what seemed solid begins to dissolve. This insight into emptiness is not meant to evoke despair, rather, it is meant to free us from illusion. By understanding the impermanent, interconnected nature of all things, we can loosen the grip of attachment and suffering, allowing us to engage with life in a way that is more fluid, open, and compassionate. The Buddha illustrated this concept with a famous analogy, the chariot analogy. One day, a disciple asked him about the nature of the self. Instead of giving a direct answer, the Buddha posed the question, where is the chariot? Is it in the wheels? The seat? The yoke? The frame? His followers examined each part, but no single component could be identified as the chariot itself. Nor could they point to the sum of the parts and say, this is the chariot. The chariot existed only as a designation, a concept that arises when all these parts are assembled in a specific way. The same applies to the self. When we examine what we call I, what do we find? A body, thoughts, memories, emotions. But is there a single unchanging entity that can be called me? Just like the chariot, what we experience as self is nothing more than a collection of parts that temporarily come together. The problem is, we treat this shifting collection as something fixed, solid, and unchanging. This attachment to a permanent self is the root of suffering because it blinds us to the truth of impermanence. To deepen this understanding, let's consider another analogy, the ocean and the wave. When we see a wave rising from the ocean, we give it a name, that is a wave. But where does the wave actually begin? Where does it end? Is it separate from the ocean? No. The wave exists only because of the movement of the water, the wind, and countless unseen factors. It does not have an independent existence, it is merely a manifestation of conditions. The moment those conditions shift, the wave dissolves back into the ocean. It was never separate to begin with. This is exactly how all things exist. Everything that we label objects, emotions, even ourselves is like the wave, interdependent, constantly changing, without a fixed essence. Nothing stands alone. This realization, far from being depressing, is actually liberating. Consider how much of our suffering arises from clinging to identities, relationships, possessions, or rigid beliefs about how life should be. We construct stories about who we are. I am this kind of person, this is my role, this is my purpose. We hold on tightly to these ideas, believing that they define us. But what happens when life inevitably changes? What happens when a career ends? When a loved one departs, when the circumstances that shaped our identity no longer exist? If we believe in a fixed self, then these moments feel like devastating losses. But if we understand emptiness, we see that change is not the enemy, it is simply the nature of existence. Just as the wave does not resist returning to the ocean, we can learn to move with life rather than against it. This perspective shifts how we relate to the world. Instead of grasping at things as if they were permanent, we begin to appreciate them as they are, temporary, fleeting, yet beautiful in their impermanence. Think about a cherry blossom. Its beauty does not come from how long it lasts, but from the very fact that it is fleeting. If cherry blossoms bloomed eternally, we might take them for granted. Their impermanence makes them precious. The same applies to every moment of our lives. The people we love, the experiences we cherish, even our struggles, they are meaningful not despite their impermanence, but because of it. When we stop resisting change, we start truly living. Buddhism teaches that clinging to fixed ideas of self and reality is what binds us to suffering. When we mistake temporary phenomena for something permanent, we create attachment, and attachment leads to fear of loss, fear of change, fear of the unknown. But emptiness dissolves that fear. It does not mean detachment in the sense of emotional numbness. Rather, it means engaging with the world without clinging, loving deeply but without possessiveness, enjoying life but without fear of loss. This is the balance that emptiness brings: presence without attachment, engagement without entrapment. A modern way to relate to this concept is through the mirror analogy. A mirror reflects everything that appears before it without holding on to anything. It does not resist the images that come and go, it simply reflects reality as it is. In the same way, when we understand emptiness, we no longer cling to transient experiences. We engage fully, but we do not get stuck. This allows us to experience freedom in every moment, to embrace life without being burdened by false attachments. The great paradox of emptiness is that by realizing everything is empty of inherent existence, we actually begin to see the fullness of life. We stop filtering reality through rigid ideas and instead open ourselves to the interconnected, ever-changing nature of the world. This insight is what allows Buddhist practitioners to cultivate both wisdom and compassion. When we see that nothing exists independently, we realize that we, too, are not separate from others. Our suffering is not isolated, our happiness is not disconnected. This understanding naturally leads to greater kindness and empathy, because we see that the boundary between self and other is merely conceptual. In essence, emptiness is not a void, it is a space of possibility. It is the understanding that life is fluid, not fixed, interdependent, not separate. This realization does not take us away from life, it returns us to it, fully and freely. When we stop resisting reality, when we stop clinging to the illusion of permanence, we find that true peace is not in holding on but in letting go. Chapter 2: The Interdependent Nature of Reality. Most people go through life believing that things exist independently. We see objects, people, and even ourselves as separate, self-contained entities. This assumption is so deeply ingrained in our thinking that we rarely stop to question it. But the Buddha challenged this perspective with one of his most profound teachings, praditya samitpada, or dependent origination. This principle states that nothing exists by itself, everything arises due to causes and conditions. It is a radical departure from the way we typically perceive the world, and understanding it has the power to completely transform our relationship with reality. The Buddha expressed this insight in a simple yet profound way: when this exists, that comes to be; with the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. These words encapsulate a truth that underlies every aspect of existence: everything is interconnected. No person, object, thought, or emotion appears in isolation. Everything is part of a web of interdependent relationships. This means that nothing has an inherent, independent essence, a realization that naturally aligns with the concept of emptiness, Shunyata. While emptiness reveals that things lack an independent, fixed nature, dependent origination explains why everything exists in relation to something else. To grasp this concept more clearly, let's take something seemingly simple: a cup. At first glance, a cup appears to be a distinct, singular object. You see it sitting on a table and think, this is a cup, and it exists. But if we analyze it more closely, we begin to see that its existence is completely dependent on numerous factors. The cup is made of clay, but that clay came from the earth, shaped by geological processes over thousands of years. It was molded by the hands of a potter, fired in a kill, and given form by external conditions. Even our perception of it as a cup is a product of our human mind, an animal that has evolved to see and label objects in a certain way. Without all these conditions, there would be no cup. So, does the cup exist independently? No, it only exists in relation to the conditions that created it. This same logic applies to everything, including ourselves. We often think of our identity as something fixed. I am this kind of person. I have this personality. These are my traits. But if we look deeply, we see that our sense of self is also a product of interdependent causes. Who we are is shaped by our culture, upbringing, relationships, environment, and even biological factors like genetics. If any of these influences had been different, we would be a completely different person. This means that the self we hold onto so tightly is not an independent entity. It is fluid, ever-changing, and dependent on countless conditions. This realization has profound implications. It challenges the illusion of separateness, the mistaken belief that we exist as isolated beings, disconnected from everything around us. Most of our suffering stems from this illusion. We divide the world into me and other, mine and yours, and we cling to these distinctions as if they were real. But if everything is interconnected, then these divisions are merely conceptual. They exist only in our minds. Recognizing this allows us to see beyond our conditioned sense of self and understand that our existence is not separate from the world, but deeply intertwined with it. A powerful example of this is our relationship with nature. Many people today feel disconnected from the environment. We see ourselves as something apart from nature, as if we are merely observers of the world rather than participants in its unfolding. But dependent origination reminds us that we are not separate from the earth, the air, the water, or the ecosystems around us. The food we eat comes from plants and animals that rely on sunlight, soil, and rain. The oxygen we breathe comes from trees and oceanic plankton. The very cells in our bodies are made from elements that were once part of ancient stars. The illusion of separateness is just that, an illusion. This understanding leads to a profound shift in how we view our relationships with others. If nothing exists independently, then we are not isolated individuals, but interconnected beings whose happiness and suffering are deeply linked. The barriers we construct between self and other begin to dissolve. We stop seeing people as competitors or threats and start recognizing that their pain is our pain, and their joy is our joy. This is why compassion naturally arises from wisdom. When we see that there is no fixed separation between me and you, we no longer turn away from the suffering of others. Instead, we feel compelled to help, because we recognize that we are all part of the same web of existence. To put this into a practical perspective, consider how our emotions and reactions are shaped by external conditions. Have you ever had a bad day, where everything seemed to go wrong, and then taken out your frustration on someone else, perhaps snapping at a friend or family member? In that moment, it might have felt as though your anger was purely yours, that it originated from within you. But if you look closer, you'll see that your mood was influenced by external causes, maybe lack of sleep, an argument earlier in the day, stress at work, or even the weather. Similarly, when someone is rude to us, we tend to take it personally. But their behavior is also a result of causes and conditions. Perhaps they were having a terrible day, or they are struggling with something we don't see. Recognizing this helps us respond with understanding rather than reaction. This principle also applies on a societal level. Many of the world's problems, conflicts, inequalities, environmental destruction stem from the failure to see our interdependence. We act as if we can pursue our self-interest at the expense of others, but in reality, our well-being is deeply connected to the well-being of the whole. When we destroy nature, we harm ourselves. When we exploit others, we create conditions for suffering that eventually come back to us. Dependent origination teaches us that we cannot truly thrive unless the world around us thrives as well. At its core, this teaching is an invitation to wake up. It calls us to see the world as it is, rather than how our minds habitually frame it. It asks us to look beyond our conditioned beliefs of separation and recognize the truth of interconnection. This understanding is not just intellectual, it is something that must be felt, lived, and embodied in our daily actions. When we deeply realize that everything is connected, we begin to move through life differently. We cultivate more patience, because we understand that people's actions arise from conditions beyond our control. We develop greater humility, because we see that who we are is not ours alone, but the result of countless influences. We grow in compassion, because we recognize that others' struggles are not separate from our own. The great paradox of dependent origination is that the more we realize that nothing stands alone, the more free we become. Instead of clinging to a rigid, isolated self, we embrace the fluidity of life. Instead of seeing change as a threat, we see it as the natural unfolding of interdependent causes. And instead of feeling disconnected from others, we recognize that we are part of an intricate, ever-changing whole. This is not just a philosophical insight, it is a way of seeing that liberates us from suffering. When we no longer grasp at things as permanent or separate, we live with a sense of ease, openness, and interconnected compassion. This is why the Buddha described dependent origination not just as a profound truth about reality, but as the very key to awakening. Chapter 3: Emptiness in Daily Life. Most people think of emptiness as an abstract philosophical concept, something to be contemplated, debated, or understood in theory. But in Buddhism, emptiness is not just a doctrine to be intellectually grasped, it is meant to be lived, experienced, and practiced. It is not a distant ideal reserved for monks or scholars, it is something that directly impacts how we respond to everyday situations, how we relate to others, and how we navigate life's inevitable changes. The real power of emptiness lies not in complex philosophical discussions, but in its transformative effect on our daily lives. A helpful way to understand this is through the mirror analogy. A mirror reflects whatever appears before it, whether it is a beautiful face, a stormy sky, or a pile of trash. But the mirror does not cling to beauty, nor does it resist ugliness. It does not hold on to past reflections, nor does it anticipate what will appear next. It simply reflects reality as it is, without attachment, without distortion. When we truly understand emptiness, we become like the mirror. We engage with the world fully, but we do not get trapped by clinging, resistance, or illusion. We experience joy, but we do not become attached to it. We encounter pain, but we do not define ourselves by it. We interact with others, but we do not grasp at relationships as if they were unchanging. This shift in perception affects every aspect of life, starting with how we handle criticism. Most of us react defensively when we are criticized because we believe that the criticism is an attack on our fixed, solid self. We feel the need to protect our ego, to prove that we are right, or to seek validation from others. But if we understand that the self is not fixed, then we realize that criticism is not a personal attack, it is simply a phenomenon arising from conditions. The words spoken by another person are influenced by their mood, their experiences, their background, and even their own suffering. If someone insults you, it may have less to do with you and more to do with what they are carrying inside. Recognizing this allows us to respond with wisdom rather than reactivity. Instead of immediately defending ourselves, we can pause and ask, what is the cause of this person's words? Is there truth in what they are saying? If so, can I learn from it? If not, can I let it go? This approach dissolves the unnecessary suffering caused by ego-based reactions. A similar perspective applies to dealing with loss. One of the greatest sources of suffering in human life is attachment to people, possessions, and circumstances. We crave permanence in a world that is inherently impermanent. We cling to relationships, believing that they will last forever. We accumulate possessions, hoping that they will bring lasting satisfaction. But reality does not conform to our desires. Everything we love will eventually change, fade, or disappear. This is an unavoidable truth, yet most people resist it, which only intensifies suffering. However, when we truly understand emptiness, we begin to appreciate things as they are, in the present moment, without clinging. Instead of fearing the loss of a loved one, we cherish the time we have with them now. Instead of lamenting the impermanence of joy, we fully experience it while it lasts, knowing that its temporary nature makes it even more precious. When we live with this understanding, we no longer try to hold on to life with a tight fist. Instead, we open our hands and let everything flow naturally. This realization also helps us in overcoming fear, particularly the fear of change. Change is one of the most feared aspects of existence because it threatens the illusion of stability. People resist change in careers, relationships, health, and even their own self-image because they believe that who they are today is who they must always be. But when we recognize that nothing is inherently fixed, we stop resisting change, we embrace it. Just as a river is always flowing, always adapting to new landscapes, we too are in a constant state of becoming. The person you were 5 years ago is not the same person you are today, and the person you are today will not be the person you become in the future. Seeing life through the lens of emptiness allows us to let go of fear and trust in the natural unfolding of existence. To understand this in a real-world context, consider the experience of failure. Many people become trapped by failure because they define themselves by their mistakes. If they fail at a job, they believe they are a failure. If they experience heartbreak, they believe they are unworthy of love. But emptiness teaches us that failure, like everything else, is impermanent and interdependent. It is not an absolute judgment of our worth, it is simply the result of certain conditions at a certain moment in time. If we learn from those conditions, we can grow. If we do not attach our identity to failure, we can move forward without carrying unnecessary burdens. In this way, understanding emptiness frees us from self-imposed limitations. Emptiness also transforms how we approach relationships. Most suffering in relationships arises from attachment and expectation. We enter relationships seeking validation, security, and permanence, but when things inevitably change, when a partner grows in a different direction, when friendships fade, when conflicts arise, we feel betrayed, as if something should have lasted forever. But nothing in life is static. The people in our lives, like everything else, are constantly changing. If we cling to an image of who someone was, rather than accepting who they are now, we create suffering for ourselves and for them. However, when we approach relationships with an understanding of emptiness, we love without attachment, appreciate without expectation, and accept change with grace. This does not mean detachment in the sense of indifference. On the contrary, it allows us to engage with others more deeply, because we are not clinging to illusions or false expectations. A beautiful analogy for this is holding sand in your palm. If you grip the sand tightly, trying to keep it all, it will slip through your fingers. But if you hold it with an open hand, it remains. This is how relationships should be, not grasped with fear, but held with love and openness. Another profound way emptiness manifests in daily life is through letting go of rigid beliefs and opinions. People often suffer because they are attached to being right. They cling to opinions as if their identity depends on them. But what happens when we realize that our views, like everything else, are conditioned and impermanent? We become more open-minded. We listen more than we argue. We do not feel the need to force our perspective onto others. Instead of seeing the world in absolute terms of right and wrong, we recognize that all viewpoints arise from different experiences and conditions. This makes us more understanding, more compassionate, and less likely to engage in unnecessary conflict. Consider the example of a storm. If you stand rigidly in the face of a storm, resisting the wind, you will be knocked down. But if you bend like a reed, allowing the wind to pass through you, you will remain standing. This is the essence of mental flexibility that comes from understanding emptiness. We move with life rather than against it. Emptiness also changes how we experience success and happiness. Many people chase after happiness, believing that it exists in external achievements, wealth, status, recognition. But if happiness is dependent on external conditions, it will always be fragile, because external conditions are constantly changing. One day you are praised, the next you are criticized. One moment you are successful, the next you face setbacks. But when we understand emptiness, we see that happiness does not come from clinging to external things. It comes from embracing each moment as it is, without grasping. This is why Buddhist teachings emphasize inner peace over external validation. The more we integrate emptiness into daily life, the more we experience freedom, ease, and genuine contentment. We no longer live in fear of losing what we have, because we understand that everything is impermanent. We no longer feel the need to prove ourselves, because we recognize that the self is fluid and ever-changing. We no longer struggle against life, because we have learned to move with its natural flow. At its core, emptiness is not about detachment from life. It is about engaging with life fully, but without illusion. When we let go of rigid attachments, we do not lose anything, we gain everything. We gain clarity, peace, and the ability to love and experience life in a way that is deep, open, and free. Chapter 4: Key Teachings on Emptiness. Emptiness is one of the most profound yet challenging concepts in Buddhism. It is not a doctrine meant to be believed blindly, it is a perspective meant to awaken us to the true nature of existence. However, for most people, the idea that things do not exist as they appear feels counterintuitive. We experience a world full of forms, sounds, and emotions. How can we say that these things are empty? This is why Buddhist scriptures and philosophical texts provide skillful means to help us break free from habitual patterns of thinking and see reality as it truly is. Two of the most influential sources on emptiness are the Heart Sutra and the Madhyamaka philosophy of Nagarjuna. These teachings serve as a gateway, not just to an intellectual understanding, but to a lived experience of emptiness, one that can liberate the mind from suffering. One of the most famous lines in Mahayana Buddhism comes from the Heart Sutra, which states, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." At first glance, this statement seems paradoxical. How can form, something we perceive, touch, and interact with, be the same as emptiness, which suggests a lack of inherent substance? The mistake most people make is assuming that emptiness means non-existence, but this is not the case. The Heart Sutra is not denying the existence of form, rather, it is revealing that form does not exist independently or permanently. What we call form is merely a temporary manifestation of causes and conditions. It is empty of an inherent, separate essence. To understand this, think about a wave in the ocean. A wave has a distinct shape, we can see it rise and fall, and we may even give it a name, calling it a big wave or a small wave. But can we separate the wave from the ocean? The wave is not a separate thing, it exists only because of the movement of water, wind, and other factors. If the conditions change, the wave disappears back into the sea. Similarly, everything we call form in the world, our bodies, objects, even thoughts, are like waves. They appear, but they are empty of independent existence. This idea is reinforced in the second half of the statement, emptiness is form. Many people misinterpret emptiness as meaning that nothing exists at all. But emptiness is not a nihilistic concept, it is a way of seeing things more clearly. If emptiness means that things lack independent existence, then form, our daily experiences, our relationships, even the physical world, is simply the manifestation of interdependence. Emptiness is not separate from reality, it is the nature of reality. This is why a true understanding of emptiness does not lead to detachment or indifference, it leads to greater compassion, wisdom, and engagement with life. Another key teaching on emptiness comes from Nagarjuna, the Indian Buddhist philosopher who systematized the Madhyamaka, middle way, school. Nagarjuna's most famous teaching states, "Emptiness itself is empty." At first, this may seem like another paradox. If everything is empty, wouldn't that mean emptiness itself is also just another concept? Nagarjuna's point is precisely this: emptiness is not a thing to be grasped or clung to, it is merely a way of describing reality as it is. Many people, after hearing about emptiness, fall into another extreme. They begin to see emptiness as an ultimate truth, something separate from the world of forms. But Nagarjuna warns against this. If we cling to emptiness as though it were an absolute reality, we are simply creating another illusion. Emptiness is not something to be believed in, it is something to be experienced directly. To illustrate this, consider a reflection in a mirror. A mirror shows whatever appears before it, but the reflection is not the mirror itself. Likewise, emptiness is simply a way of describing how things exist. It is not a new doctrine to hold on to, nor is it a replacement for reality. Nagarjuna's teachings dismantle our tendency to turn emptiness into a fixed concept and instead invite us to directly observe how things arise and pass away without independent existence. One of the most famous arguments Nagarjuna presents is the fourfold negation, which demonstrates how we cannot make absolute statements about reality. He explains that things 1. Do not inherently exist. 2. Do not inherently not exist. 3. Do not both exist and not exist. 4. Do not neither exist nor not exist. This may sound confusing at first, but its purpose is to break down the rigid categories of human thinking. We are conditioned to see things in binary terms: something either exists or it doesn't. But in reality, existence is not that simple. Everything arises due to causes and conditions, and everything is dependent on perspective. When we say a tree exists, what do we mean? Does it exist as a tree in itself, independent of the soil, the sunlight, or the observer perceiving it? No, it exists only in relation to other factors. Nagarjuna's teachings guide us to see beyond our habitual ways of thinking and realize that reality is far more dynamic and interdependent than our language can capture. The teachings on emptiness are not just abstract philosophy, they have direct, practical applications in daily life. By understanding emptiness, we begin to see that most of our suffering comes from clinging to fixed ideas about ourselves, about others, and about the world. We assume that things should be a certain way, and when reality does not conform to our expectations, we suffer. But if we recognize that all things are empty of permanence and fixed identity, we stop resisting change, we embrace it. For example, consider how emptiness applies to emotions. If we experience anger, we often feel as though the anger is an unchangeable reality, as if we are the anger itself. But if we look deeper, we see that the anger arises from causes and conditions, it is not intrinsically ours. The moment we see that anger is impermanent, conditioned, and empty of an inherent self, it loses its grip on us. We no longer get trapped in it because we understand that it is simply another passing phenomenon. This same insight can transform how we view our relationships. Many conflicts arise because we assume that people have fixed identities. We label someone as good or bad, kind or selfish, and then react to them based on those labels. But when we understand emptiness, we see that people are not fixed entities. They, too, are constantly changing, shaped by conditions just like everything else. This allows us to be more forgiving, more compassionate, and more open-minded. Instead of reacting rigidly, we can respond with wisdom and understanding. Even success and failure are empty. We often attach our self-worth to external achievements, believing that if we succeed, we are worthy, and if we fail, we are unworthy. But success and failure are not inherent qualities, they are simply temporary conditions. One moment you are praised, the next moment you are criticized. One day you are thriving, the next day you are struggling. If we cling to these experiences as if they define us, we create suffering. But if we understand their emptiness, we move through life with greater ease and freedom. At its core, emptiness is not a doctrine of negation, it is a teaching of liberation. It helps us to see reality clearly, without illusion, and to engage with life without attachment, fear, or resistance. The more we integrate this understanding, the more we experience peace, flexibility, and compassion. Nagarjuna and the Heart Sutra remind us that emptiness is not something distant or mystical, it is the nature of every moment, every thought, every interaction. To truly grasp it is to see the world as it is, and in doing so, to be truly free. Chapter 5, Emptiness as the Path to Liberation. For most people, the word emptiness evokes a sense of loss, detachment, or even nihilism. The very idea of letting go feels like giving up on life, as if emptiness means withdrawing from emotions, relationships, or meaningful pursuits. But in Buddhism, emptiness is not about escaping life, it is about fully engaging with it without clinging. It is about experiencing everything: joy, sorrow, love, loss without being trapped by attachment, fear, or illusion. True liberation does not come from avoiding the world, but from seeing it clearly, without grasping at what is impermanent. At the heart of suffering is attachment. The Buddha taught that suffering arises when we cling to possessions, people, status, beliefs, and even our own identity. We desperately try to hold on to things, fearing their loss, as if they could provide permanent security. But reality does not work this way. Everything in life is in constant motion, yet we resist this truth. We grasp at relationships, hoping they will never change. We chase success, believing it will bring lasting happiness. We form rigid identities, convinced that we are a fixed self that will always remain the same. But nothing is fixed, nothing is permanent. When we cling, we set ourselves up for inevitable disappointment. Imagine holding a handful of sand. If you squeeze too tightly, trying to keep it, the sand slips through your fingers. But if you hold it with an open palm, it remains. This is the essence of non-attachment. Letting go does not mean losing something, it means freeing ourselves from the fear of loss. It means loving fully but without possessiveness. It means appreciating life as it is, rather than as we wish it to be. Understanding emptiness does not make us indifferent, it allows us to engage with life with greater clarity and freedom. We begin to appreciate relationships without trying to control them, to enjoy experiences without fearing their end, and to embrace change without resisting it. Life itself becomes lighter, more fluid, and more joyful when we no longer grasp at the impossible promise of permanence. This perspective also transforms how we handle pain and loss. When we believe that something or someone is inherently ours, we suffer when it changes or disappears. But if we see that everything exists only in relation to conditions, we begin to accept loss with greater wisdom. This does not mean we do not grieve, it means we do not resist the natural flow of life. We allow ourselves to feel fully, without being consumed by sorrow. Far from making us detached, realizing emptiness actually deepens our compassion. The more we understand that we are not separate from others, the more naturally kindness arises. We often think of suffering as something personal, something that happens to us, but suffering is universal, it touches every being. The same impermanence that affects us also affects others. When we see this clearly, we begin to treat others with more patience, more forgiveness, and more love. A key misunderstanding about emptiness is that it leads to cold detachment. But the opposite is true. Those who deeply understand emptiness often love more deeply, because they no longer love with fear. They do not hold on to others out of insecurity. They do not expect people to be unchanging. They do not impose conditions on their love. Instead, they love freely, with an open heart, embracing each moment fully. This is why emptiness and compassion go hand in hand. When we stop seeing ourselves as isolated, when we recognize that all beings are interconnected, kindness becomes effortless. Compassion is not something we force, it naturally arises when we see reality as it is. When we truly understand that there is no fixed I and no fixed other, the barriers between self and others dissolve. We begin to act with genuine care, because we see that the happiness of others is not separate from our own. This is beautifully illustrated by the lotus flower metaphor. A lotus grows from the mud, yet it remains unstained by it. It does not reject the mud, it needs the mud in order to bloom. Similarly, emptiness does not mean withdrawing from the world. It means engaging with it fully, experiencing its joys and sorrows, without being tainted by attachment. Just as the lotus rises above the water, we can move through life without being trapped by grasping, fear, or illusion. The same principle applies to our thoughts and emotions. Most people are entangled in their own minds. They identify with every thought. They become trapped in every emotion. If anger arises, they say, "I am angry," as if anger is their identity. If fear appears, they believe it defines them. But emptiness teaches us that thoughts and emotions are like passing clouds. They arise due to conditions, and they will pass away. When we stop clinging to them, we no longer get lost in them. This does not mean suppressing emotions, it means seeing them clearly and letting them go. If sadness comes, we acknowledge it, but we do not let it consume us. If joy arises, we savor it, but we do not cling to it. Everything flows naturally, without resistance. We experience life fully, yet we are not trapped by it. One of the greatest fears people have is the fear of death. We cling to the idea of a permanent self, and when we confront impermanence, we feel anxiety. But emptiness dissolves the fear of death. If there is no fixed self, then what is there to fear? The body changes, thoughts come and go, but there is no unchanging essence to be lost. When we understand this deeply, death is no longer something to be feared, it is simply another transition in a vast, interconnected flow of existence. By seeing emptiness clearly, we also free ourselves from the illusions of success and failure. Most people chase after external achievements, believing that these things define their worth. But success and failure are not absolute realities, they are simply temporary conditions. If we attach our happiness to success, we will always be anxious, because circumstances are beyond our control. If we believe failure defines us, we will never move forward. Emptiness teaches us that neither success nor failure is truly ours, they are impermanent, conditioned, and empty of inherent identity. When we let go of these illusions, we live with greater ease and confidence. Emptiness also changes how we approach challenges. Many people struggle because they view difficulties as obstacles, things that should not be happening. But what if challenges are not problems? What if they are simply part of the natural flow of life? A river does not fight against rocks in its path, it simply moves around them. Similarly, when we stop resisting life, we move with it. We no longer see difficulties as something to be avoided, but as something to be experienced with wisdom. The more we integrate emptiness into daily life, the more we discover true freedom. We are no longer controlled by fear, no longer imprisoned by attachment, no longer deceived by illusions. Instead, we move through life with an open heart and an open mind. We engage with the world not as a battlefield, but as a dance, flowing effortlessly with the changing rhythms of existence. Liberation does not come from separating ourselves from the world. It comes from seeing the world as it is and not being bound by it. When we truly understand emptiness, we do not escape life, we finally become fully alive. Emptiness is not a void. It is not a rejection of life. It is the very key to living it fully. Through the understanding of emptiness, we let go of suffering not by suppressing pain, but by no longer being enslaved by it. We see life clearly not as we wish it to be, but as it actually is. We act with wisdom and compassion not from a place of attachment, but from a place of deep interconnection. We embrace change not with fear, but with an open heart. The paradox of emptiness is that by realizing everything is impermanent, fluid, and interdependent, we do not lose meaning, we gain true freedom. We stop clinging to identities that no longer serve us. We stop resisting the natural flow of life. We stop defining happiness by external conditions and instead find joy in the unfolding moment itself. The Buddha taught that awakening is not about escaping the world. It is about finally seeing it as it truly is. And in that seeing, we find a peace that is not dependent on circumstances, a peace that is not shaken by loss, not diminished by impermanence, not bound by the illusions of self. The wise one, meditative and resolute, sees the way to freedom and walks it with joy. The Buddha. By walking this path, we do not withdraw from life, we finally learn how to live it without fear, without clinging, without illusion, but with full presence, full compassion, and full wisdom. This is the freedom of emptiness. And once we begin to glimpse it, we realize it was never emptiness at all. It was life itself, seen clearly, for the very first time.